all. I am speaking to you live from beautiful County Carlow in Ireland. Indeed, the farm where I live is on land that belonged to the Butlers for almost 500 years. And as you've heard, this is the inaugural talk for the Butler Society, founded in 1967. So I'll be giving a bit of a chat about that later on. My immediate brief is to tell you about 900 years of history in the next 60 or 70 minutes, which gives me about 46 seconds per decade. I'm told that there's about 43 different nationalities of Butler at this time as well, so we'll try and fit that in. But fear not, we shall take this at our own pace. This is not a definitive history of the family, of course. I'm going to try not to bog you down with too many dates. Many of you will be far more informed than I and learned on the subject, especially with your own branches of the family. So consider this a kind of beginner's guide to who the Butlers were and where they came from and some of the ways that their lives played out. And there will be some colourful tales along the way. The talk is for members of the Butler Society, and for those who are thinking of becoming a member. I haven't given this talk before, so forgive the inevitable stumbles, and I'm now going to switch to my presentation, which I'm going to share a screen here, which I hope I can do, David, can I?
I think so, yes. You should have co-host privileges, so it should work.
Yep.
There we go, it's starting now.
Yep, you have it. Okay, fabulous. Butler ABOO. Okay. Butler ABOO, for those of you who don't know, that is our family war cry when you were charging into battle with your lance and axe held high. That's what you shouted, Butler ABOO. One of the, let me just get this so that I can flick it on to the next, sorry. There we go, sorry. One of the first things I learned as a history student was to check out who your historian is. What's their connection to the subject matter? So very quickly, I am one half Butler. My mother, who is reputedly watching this evening, started life as a Butler. She grew up farming in Kilkenny, outside Bennett's Bridge, for those who know. That is her at the very first Butler rally in 1967 with her parents and my dad and her cousin Mello. Her dad, pictured on the left there, Gilbert Butler, my grandfather, was a brother of Hubert Butler, who Susanna mentioned earlier, one of the co-founders of the Butler Society and indeed Susanna's grandfather. So it is a family affair. And indeed, some of you might remember our wonderful cousin Mello, who was secretary of the Butler Society for so many years, my mum's first cousin, one of her best friends, who is already nearly 10 years gone, for those who remember dear Mello. And also my lovely uncle James, who was the chairman of this society and who passed away last summer. A really wonderful guy who who'd enjoyed a fascinating life in Tanzania in the 1960s before taking on his family farm in Kilkenny. So as well as living on the old Butler lands here, that's my family connection. Our line descends from a branch of the Dunboynes, but we are but one of multiple branches of this family. Don't worry, we're not going to go into detail with this scary looking chart in front of you. How many Butlers are there in the world today, by birth, by marriage, by repute? I mean, really, tens of thousands? For sure. 100,000? I don't know. The late Baron Dunboyne, Paddy Dunboyne, who was another co-founder of the Butler Society, he reckoned there were about 65 lines of Butler, different branches. I think he wrote down most of them with a biro on the back of a bunch of Kellogg's cereal boxes once upon a time. But that includes, for instance, the Butler branches of Ormond and Dunboyne, Clonamicklin, Icaran, Cahir, Polestown, Rosscray, Mountgarrett, Clochbrennan, Ballintemple, Kilcash, Duishk, Thurles, Garryricken, Priesttown, New Ross, Butler's Wharf, Hambledown, and many more. So you can see we start to build quite a massive dynasty. Worry not, we won't be going into the land of family trees in this talk, as that is an endless warren of rabbit holes, which I do not wish to go to. Incidentally, if, well, I think if you're new to Zoom, or I only learned this recently, but if you can't see the pictures on the screen that well, you can click in the top right, you can go to the view button, and you can click one of those things and it hides the thumbnail views, which might make your visuals better. So, where did we come from? Well, needless to say, that's quite a mystery. Now, when I'm talking of our ancestry, I'm of course talking about the male line, and I'm sorry, ladies, you can blame the Normans for this, because they started it all with their chivalry and their men-only primogeniture shenanigans. But the Butler family, the male line of this family, is said by some to have its roots in Brittany or Armorica, which you can see on the map there on the west coast of France, and that we were thus Bretons who arrived into England with the Normans. Others push our place of origin around the corner to Normandy in North France, which was the home place of the Normans. But there is no such thing as a straight up Norman. The Normans, well, they were Vikings. So that would mean the Butlers kind of started as Vikings. We perhaps a splash of Anglo-Saxon, a dollop of Germanic Frank, and who knows, a dash of Roman, a hint of barbarian, and a sprinkle of Celt for good measure. Because frankly, if I have learned one thing from history, it's that we are all composed of a lot more different bits and bobs of people's past than you might think. That's the genetics, but culturally, our earliest ancestors, the earliest ones we know about, were Norman. So what does it mean to be Norman? Very quickly. Well, aside from speaking French, it means we like bunny rabbits. We ate their meat and we made clothes out of their lovely soft bunny fur. We liked eating pheasants and swan and hunting for fallow deer. And we ate apples and peaches and frogs. They loved a bit of roast frog for their dinner. There were nice dishes too. Sauteed mushrooms was apparently very popular with these Normans, I'm told. They are also famous for their castles. Loved building castles out of wood initially, and then out of this amazing revolutionary stuff that didn't rot called stone. And so those castles, their castellated homes, survive all over the former Norman Empire to this day, which is pretty amazing to have all this architectural legacy from that era still around us, especially here in Ireland. The influence of the Normans on this planet's history is frankly too massive to go into here. They brought feudalism and the parish system, the tax system, banking, guilds, charters, all that stuff, a whole new set of legal rules that changed everything. And they were, of course, also brilliant warriors, okay? They were charging around on horseback with chain armor and new types of pointy weapons that their enemies couldn't compete with, and which would give them power over an informal empire that once extended all the way to Jerusalem. Just a very quick interruption there, David. I think that there is little sound coming in. Maybe somebody's got their microphone on other than me, just in case that's going to confuse people there. Okay. All of this came into play in 1066 when the Norman army, commanded by William the Conqueror, crushed the Anglo-Saxons in a single battle, the Battle of Hastings, and began this slow and steady takeover of England. And thereafter, the Normans, these French-speaking Normans, ones who settled in England, became known as Anglo-Normans. And just to confuse you, the ones who settled in Wales and on the Welsh borders become known as the Cambro-Normans, okay? So the picture you're looking at is from the Bayeux Tapestry, a very famous tapestry produced after the Norman conquest of England, depicting all the details of the conquest. It's a wonderful sort of little bit of early animation. And what we're looking at in that picture at the center is King Harold, the enemy of William the Conqueror, getting an arrow in the eye, the arrow that killed him. And that was the end of him, the Anglo-Saxon king. The burial of Harold was entrusted by William the Conqueror to a fellow called William Mallet, who was not only sort of part Anglo-Saxon, but he is also said to have been the great-great-grandfather of the first named member of our family, Walter Fitzharvey. I don't know, I know not if this is true. There is no direct evidence, but William Mallet definitely fought at the Battle of Hastings, and he is, as I said, reputed to have been given this job of burying Harold. The descendant I mentioned of William Mallet, this guy, Walter Fitzharvey, he's a cousin of St. Thomas à Becket, the very famous Archbishop Thomas à Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury. And he married a wealthy Norman heiress, which is a clever thing to do, and the Butlers became very good at marrying heiresses over the ensuing centuries. They stopped around about 2010, but I love my wife very much. They had a bunch of sons. One was a judge called Osbert, and Osbert's brother was called Hubert. And they were immensely powerful in the reign of the era of Richard the Lionheart, and we'll come to him in a moment. Hubert was Chief Justiciar of England and Archbishop of Canterbury and Lord Chancellor of England, so big jobs. And you'll note that name Hubert, as in my great uncle was called Hubert, and who founded the Butler co-founded the Butler Society. His brother, my grandfather, was Gilbert. I'm pretty sure if they'd had a third brother, he would have been called Osbert. And it is a fine name if anyone out there is looking to name an upcoming son, Osbert, or a daughter, Osbertina, perhaps. But okay, our attention should turn to, hang on, this, we're going this way now. We should turn our attention to Osbert and Hubert's elder brother, Theobald, okay, because almost every butler on earth today can apparently trace their lineage to Theobald. When it comes to researching family history, for me, I think the logical method is to work backwards, right, from the present day, and hopefully that'll bring you back into the 19th century, or maybe the 18th century, or earlier, and then you can try and come from the other direction with the family, what you know about their early origins, back to the start, and you work forward, and if you can get the two to meet, then hey presto. To get back to Theobald, you need to rewind maybe 30, 35 generations. I know that's a lot of generations, but it's not a lot of people. You might have had that many people in your house on Thanksgiving or Christmas Day, not this year, but in the good old pre-pandemic days. So why are we looking at a picture of King John? You might know about him. He was a son of King Henry II, and his wife, the famous Eleanor of Aquitaine. And a younger brother of Richard the Lionheart. And you'd probably know him as the infamous King John of Robin Hood fame. But actually, the next time you watch Robin Hood, it's arguable that you should be rooting for King John, because Theobald Butler, founder of this dynasty, was part of King John's gang, or certainly at the start. Theobald was born in about 1150 AD, which means he was a very old man of 35 when he first arrived in Ireland with John in 1185, and sent over, actually, Theobald by John's parents to keep an eye on the young prince, who, as well as being a Prince John, was also at that time Lord of Ireland. And you'll note that the name Ireland has now turned up in our story quite a bit. So, Ireland, what is going on there? Many of you have hopefully visited this gorgeous island. Ireland has been populated for about 10,000 years, maybe a little bit more. And there was a huge amount of activity in all over this island in the Stone Age and the Bronze Age, and much of it connected to astronomy and agriculture. Leaving us with an incredible architectural legacy, such as what you're looking at there, the Ballynoe stone circle in County Down. But that's, you get these amazing sites all over the place. Ireland was not conquered by the Romans, although it did do a whack of trade with the Roman Empire during the sort of 400 or so years that the Romans were in the vicinity and next door Roman Britain. And of course, Ireland ended up being one of the leading lights of the due course. We thus ended up with, well, St. Patrick and monasteries and hermitages on places like what you're looking at there, the beautiful Skellig Islands, high crosses galore. You might have heard of the Book of Kells. All this stuff, amazing, rich early Christian heritage was all in place as well before the Butlers arrived. Indeed, the reputed wealth of Irish monasteries, of course, had drawn the Normans' ancestors of sorts, the Vikings, to Irish shores. So all this is coming up. We're building up to the arrival of the Normans and Theobald Butler. This is a sort of rough look of what Ireland was looking like on the eve of the Normans, and you'll see it's a lot of fairly hazy kingdoms and mini kingdoms. You can see some of those Viking cities around the coast of Ireland there, Vedrafjord and Weisfjord, which are now Waterford and Wexford and Dublin. So it's quite an attractive proposition if you're Normans and younger sons thinking, where are we going to go next? So the Normans arrived in Ireland in the year 1169 and 1170, so just over 850 years ago. Strongbow and his merry men, for those who know that story. I'm not going to go into that here, but very quickly they dominated much of the south and eastern parts, the whole eastern seaboard of the country, and they were whacking up castles all over the place and intermarrying with the main chiefs and indeed kings of Ireland, and establishing a very strong foothold here. This is Cork City, where on the eve of when the Normans were first piling into the country, there was a man called Dermot More McCarthy, who was the king of Desmond. Now, I don't know if any McCarthys are watching this evening in Ireland, but I'm sorry to say that King Dermot was assassinated in 1185, apparently bumped off during a peace parley near this city of Cork was then. And the monks who wrote about this afterwards seemed to implicate no less a man than Theobald Butler in this dastardly deed. They write, and thus did he, as in King Dermot, and thus did he pay for his error in woe, his life to the butler, his crown to the foe. So on behalf of my ancestors, I would like to take this opportunity to apologize to the citizens of Cork and indeed to the McCarthys for killing your king. Sorry about that. His crown to the foe. Can we blame King John, Prince John? After Dermot McCarthy More was killed, John granted Cork its first charter, very similar to Bristol. The rights were very similar to Bristol for those who know Bristol. And meanwhile, Theobald went from strength to strength as part of King John's entourage. In 1192, he was one of 15 men present when Prince John granted a royal charter to the liberties of Dublin. And on that document, he is notably described as the butler. And that is the first reference we have to the word butler, the name Butler. Sorry, the thing you're looking at there, just in case you're getting excited, isn't that document. That's actually Magna Carta, but it looked like that. Now, butler, of course, that doesn't mean butler in Mountain Bee, G. Worcester sense. The original concept of a butler was the person in charge of the prince, in this instance, Prince John's buttery. Okay. And that's where all his butts of wine were stored, a butt being 2 hogsheads, or 573 litres to be precise, of wine. So Prince John basically granted Theobald the hereditary office of Botelier, or made him the chief butler of Ireland, from which his descendants and many of you, hundreds of people watching this evening, take your surname. hereditary is the important word here. The Normans loved primogeniture, which is basically, for those who don't know, it's the feudal concept of everything going to the eldest surviving male son or male heir. So the office of chief butler, for instance, would pass from Theobald to his eldest son, along with the castles and lands, and onwards to the next son, and so on and so on. Unless there was no son, or unless one of the sons was bumped off by another son. Those sort of things happened every now and then. So the original office of chief butler, it was kind of one of those ceremonial pomp and show positions that the British have always done very well. And Theobald was technically on standby with his as cupbearer to John on those big royal occasions. But he was subsequently awarded pricing of wines, or maybe it's the présage of wines. I don't know how to say the word présage, I think, meaning that he and his descendants had the right to approximately 1/10 of the cargo of any wine ship that broke bulk in Ireland, that came into Ireland. Put another way, that entitled him to claim 2 of every 13 barrels of wine that came into Irish ports. That's a huge thing. I mean, in case you think Ireland wasn't a wine country back then, this is what one witness wrote in 1185, the year Theobald arrived. Imported wines are so abundant in Ireland, you would scarcely notice that the vine was neither cultivated nor gave its fruit there. Apparently, while I'm on it, the collective name for a group of butlers is a draft, and that refers to the samples you draw off from each barrel for the butler to taste. So technically speaking, as I address you now here, butlers of the world, a group of butlers, I think I'm addressing a draft of butlers. Anyway, that highly lucrative arrangement, by the way, the wine tax, was held by the head of the Butler family right up until 1810, when the British Crown bought it back by an act of Parliament for the then considerable sum of £210,000 sterling. Right, okay, as well as becoming chief butler, Theobald was granted a sizable chunk of northeast Munster and pushing into Leinster, and that includes a lot of the land that you're looking at on that map there. I mean, it's Limerick, it was Tipperary and Clare, but there was also chunks of Offaly, Wexford, Kilkenny, Wicklow, and Waterford, and right up to close to where I am, Tullow Castle, built in 1192, apparently by Theobald. So he was, he got around. And he also had large estates in England. He had them in East Anglia, in Lancashire. There's a place called Cockersand Abbey in Lancaster, which he founded. King John, he on his side. In fact, he was stripped of his office and of his lands at least once, but he somehow got them back, and he got back in favor before his death in 1206, and he's actually buried in a now ruined Cistercian abbey on the Limerick-Tipperary border. After his death, his widow Maid, who was English, she returned to England and married a fellow called Fulk Fitzwarren. And he's fascinating because he later embarked on a full-blown revolt against King John, which resulted in him taking refuge in the woods and becoming an outlaw with Maud by his side. Sound familiar? I mean, understandably, some wonder whether the former Mrs. Butler and her man were the inspiration for Robin Hood and Maid Marion, who you're looking at there. Well, that's actually Errol Flynn and Olivia de Havilland in the 1938 version. I had a crush on Olivia de Havilland, on Maid Marion, when I was a young man. And isn't it amazing? She lived until last summer. Okay. On the subject of powerful Mrs. Butlers, Rhoda de Verdon, who was the wife of Theobald Butler, the second chief butler, the son of our man Theobald and Maud. Rhoda was a very well-connected lady. Her grandfather, he was an Anglo-Norman. He'd arrived into Ireland actually along with Theobald I and King John and all that lot, and he'd got a huge chunk of land. And she was very wealthy. She was such a good catch, in fact, that the new king, Henry III, son of John, ordered her to dump her first husband and marry his pal Theobald Butler II. So much for courtly romance, says she. Or maybe, who knows, Theobald II, Rohisha, maybe they were madly in love with each other, who knows? We do know that they had 2 sons and 2 daughters before Theobald II trotted off to France to help the king beat up French people, bearing in mind that Theobald himself was sort of French as well, spoke French. Anyway, Theobald II died on that time. He died in Poitou in France. And he is buried, for those who are interested, in Arklow, County Wicklow, as indeed were his son and grandson, the 3rd and 4th barons. Meanwhile, his widow, we mentioned earlier, Rohisha, she decided to build herself a castle. And the story runs, if I can get the picture of the castle there, the story runs that nobody was willing to work for Rohisha because of her lousy temper. So eventually she made an offer to marry whoever built her a castle. And given that she was still immensely wealthy, there were plenty of takers, people volunteering to build castles for her. And the winner was the unnamed architect of this place, Castle Roche, on the Louth-Armagh border. It's an impregnable bastion that was high, right on the frontiers of the Anglo-Norman controlled area, the Pale it's called, and the Gaelic kingdom of Ulster beyond. So Rohisha turned up to have a look, and shortly after she and her new husband moved in, she is said to have invited him to behold the majestic view from the highest window in the castle's banquet hall, and then shoved him out and watched him fall to his doom. It is a good story. The maths and the dates don't actually add up, and you kind of feel it was maybe some sort of myth designed actually specifically to denigrate a woman who had sought to hold her own in this macho man's world that the Anglo-Normans had created. Anyway, look, let us move on to onwards. Rohisha was the wife of the 2nd Butler. I'm going to start speeding up now if we're going to get through all those generations. The family were firmly established in Ireland by the mid-13th century, and they prospered, as you probably know, through the Middle Ages. They consolidated their hold over immense lands and wealth, as well as the earldom of Ormond. One of the biggest players was Edmund Butler. He's 5 generations on from the first Theobald. He's alive in the reign of Robert the Bruce and Edward Longshanks and Braveheart and all that stuff. In fact, he was Justiciar of Ireland, the head honcho in Ireland when Robert the Bruce became King of the Scots, 1306. Edward II made him an earl and showered him with lands and wealth when he took on Edward the Bruce's invading army. But when Edward the Bruce defeated Edmund Butler in 1317, Edmund was in disgrace, he was dismissed, and he sort of fell from power. It's like being manager of a rugby team or a baseball team or whatever. You're as good as your last match. Okay. Things came good for Edmund's son, James, under this man, Edward III. James was the 7th chief butler, and in 1328, he was created Earl of Ormond by Edward III, nearly 700 years ago. And the reason that Edward made James Butler an Earl is because James had hit the jackpot. He'd married the king's cousin, her very wealthy cousin, Eleanor de Bohun. Again, I'm probably mispronouncing the name, but she was a granddaughter of Edward I, of Edward Longshanks. So Edward III basically gave him County Tipperary, or the Palatinate of Tipperary, as a wedding present, which certainly beats giving someone a toaster or a coffee pot. The king, he needed to get influential barons like James Butler on his side because he was trying to rebuild his kingdom after his own mother and his stepfather had attempted to take control of England. So that he had a lot of work to do. Anyway, he creates this guy, the first Earl of Ormond, but doesn't get much value out of him because the first Earl of Ormond died prematurely in 1338. He is apparently buried in Goran in County Kilkenny, for those who know, a very fine 14th century tomb. I think the jury's still out as to whether it's actually him. It's still worth a visit to that wonderful place. It was also around about 1328 that we think the motto, the heraldic motto of the Butler family was introduced, comme je trouve, the court language, of course, being French still at this time. And it means as I find it, which I think is a sort of, I take things as I find them. Or maybe that's a very laid back interpretation of it. Ormond, or Ormond, the name, the title comes from the baronies of Ormond Upper and Ormond Lower, which are in County Tipperary. And that in turn was the legacy of something called the Kingdom of Ormond, which was a very short-lived kingdom in the 12th century. And Ormond in the Irish, and I was at school in Scotland, so I don't have Irish, but Ormormain, it means East Munster, which is part of an old kingdom of Ireland, was called Munster. Anyway, now we are 6, 7, 8 generations on from Theobald, so there are Butlers on planet Earth at this point, new lines, new strands, legitimate and illegitimate, moving into new castles and tower houses and thatched cottages all over Ireland, especially in Kilkenny, Tipperary, Carlow, and indeed there were lines starting to open up in England and Europe and France, Spain, and so on, as many of you will know. Some of you, like me, descend from the Dunboyne line. So very quick detour down. We come down from a guy called, well, the Theobald, the fourth chief butler, whose son, Thomas Butler, married Sinalda Le Petite, another heiress. Her dad owned the Dunboyne lordship in County Meath, which is where the River Boyne, which is what you're looking at there, that's where it flows. It flows up past Newgrange and those sort of places. Beautiful river. So the lordship of Dunboyne was her dowry, another nice wedding present. And Thomas Butler was also made the Baron Dunboyne as part of the deal, but he was killed in battle a few years later. And a little bit confusingly, the barony of Dunboyne was sort of reinvented by Henry VIII in 1541, so that Richard Butler, the present Baron Dunboyne, who is an active member of the Butler Society, he is the 30th Baron to hold the original title, but he's only the 20th since the barony was created in 1541. It's kind of like those Gregorian calendars or Persian calendars, very confusing. It is Richard's grandfather. Many of you may have met Paddy Dunboyne. There you go. He was the 18th and 28th Baron at once. Very clever thing to do. He was also co-founder of the Butler Society. Anyway, as I have said, Primogeniture was king, and headquartered in Kilkenny, the family held immense power in medieval Ireland. There was inevitably lots of wheeling and dealing and backstabbing as different sons and cousins and legitimate and illegitimate claimants to the various titles, and lots of murder and people getting hurled in the dungeons and all that. But for all the infighting, there was always outfighting too. And the biggest enemy of them all was another Norman family, a family of Norman descent, the Fitzgeralds. And I think they were probably pretty jealous of the wine tax that the Butlers, of course, still controlled, but it's a complex and repetitive feud between these two dynasties that came to a head during the Wars of the Roses. And the Wars of the Roses is this roughly 30-year-long civil war that raged all across England and into Ireland between supporters of rival claimants to the English throne. This is in the late 1400s. And in Ireland, the Butler family, headed by the Earl of Ormond, they lined out for the House of Lancaster, while their bitter foes, the Fitzgeralds, led by the Earls of Desmond and Kildare, they were staunch allies of the House of York. And Ireland was basically, it was like a supply base for troops for all these guys, as well as a place of sanctuary for English nobles on the run. It started very badly for the Butlers. The Fitzgeralds annihilated us in battle, killed upwards of 400 men in a place called Piltown in southern Kilkenny. And then the family head, the 5th Earl of Ormond, was captured and beheaded after the Battle of Towton, and his head was put upon London Bridge for all to see. So that was a kind of bad moment. But there were some fascinating moments and brilliant moments too, like this one, when one of the Butlers won the Fitzgeralds for a peace conference, and they shook hands through a hole that was cut in the chapter door of St. Patrick Cathedral. You'll see the chapter door to this day. But that maneuver, that moment of shaking hands, that's what gives rise to the expression chancing your arm, or to chance on the arm. Because, if you put your hand through, there was quite a chance that the other guy is going to chop it off. And they didn't in this instance. So it was a happy, upbeat moment. And the Wars of the Roses actually ended pretty well for the Butlers when a younger brother, a 3rd son, he succeeded as Earl of Ormond, and he got the show back on the road. He married an incredibly rich heiress. She owned zillions of sheep farms all over England, and he became known as the Wool Earl. And he was also an uber important advisor to Henry VII, who's the Wars of the Roses, to Henry VII's Queen, Elizabeth of York, for anybody who loves this Wars of the Roses stuff. And he was also an advisor to Henry VIII's first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Okay. Those of you who were with us on the 2018 Butlers, went to London and various places, will recall our visit to Hever Castle, the childhood home of Anne Boleyn. She was the court beauty who Henry VIII fell so head over heels in love with that he basically cancelled Catholicism and changed the course of world history forever. Anne's father, Thomas Boleyn, was actually made Earl of Ormond for a few years. The reason being that his mother, Anne Boleyn's granny, was a butler. She was in fact a daughter of the Wool Earl that I mentioned earlier. We haven't time to go into it all here, but that becomes relevant again when Anne is executed in 1536. And her little daughter that she had with Henry VIII grew up to be Queen Elizabeth. So Queen Elizabeth has that butler blood in her. While Elizabeth was a princess growing up, one of those little people who grew up along with her was a boy called Thomas Butler, also known as Black Tom. This is his dad, James Butler, known as James the Lame, who had an unfortunate end in London when he and his entourage were all poisoned. I think they were all poisoned over the course of a dinner. And it's the sort of thing you wonder who orchestrated it. Apparently it was accidental, but it just doesn't add up that this fellow would have been poisoned accidentally, because there's plenty of people who wished to kill the poor man. I don't know if he was a poor man. I don't know what sort of a man he was like. We've got a portrait of him though, and that is believed to be one of the earliest pictures, or if not the earliest picture we have of one of the Butler family, painted by Hans Holbein. And as I say, in the 1540s. He left a son, who I mentioned earlier, Black Tom Butler. He is one of the few men that Queen Elizabeth really trusted her cousin. And he became the 10th Earl of Ormond, a hugely influential figure in Ireland in the 16th century. What a very fine suit of armor he is wearing, I think you'll agree. In 1565, he wore a suit of armor, I don't know if it was that one or not, into the Battle of Affane, A-F-F-A-N-E, and it was the last private pitched battle in Ireland or Britain. That means between two warring dynasties, and needless to say, the opponents were the Fitzgeralds, his cousin, because there were every now and then the Butlers and Fitzgeralds intermarried, sometimes successfully. This one clearly didn't work out so well. And his cousin was the Earl of Desmond, and they had a great big battle, and Black Tom won, and he destroyed the Earl of Desmond's army. I'm not going to go into detail of all these characters because there is so much. There are such rich stories. There are so many big characters in the Butler annals, particularly in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. I don't think any of them came bigger than this fellow, really. James Butler was the first Duke of Ormond, known as the Great Duke. His life played out against the backdrop of the English Civil War and the Confederate Wars here in Ireland, and Cromwell and the Restoration and all that stuff. He was tremendous pals with Charles II, the King of England and Ireland and Scotland. He became Lord Lieutenant. He was Chancellor of Ireland. He created the Phoenix Park in Dublin. The Royal Hospital in Kilmainham is his legacy. In fact, my Bunbury ancestors came into Ireland on his watch, and the land that we have here where we farm, we rented initially from his family. And not only that, that hairdo, as you will see if you were a fan of AC/DC or Status Quo, he was an inspirational figure for 1970s rock music hairdos, and as indeed was his son, the second Duke of Ormond, James Butler, who succeeded his dad, should have succeeded, but he drowned on his way to England one day. So he succeeded. The second Duke, interesting character, but he ran up enormous debts. He also made the mistake of switching his support to the Jacobites, to the Stuarts, and so was exiled to France. When he died, as he had no heirs, the titles and the estates all reverted, ironically, to the Catholic branch of the family. Though by the turn of the 18th century, by the end of the 18th, early 19th century, that family had also conformed to become Protestant. It's complicated. I don't know how many of you watching today are related to the Dukes of Ormond or to Black Tom or Anne Boleyn. But that is a little insight into some of the earlier characters from the family annals. You can read up on all of this and much more detail in the book that is on your screen now, The Chief Butlers of Ireland and the House of Ormond, written and edited by John Kerwin, who is the researcher and archivist and correspondence secretary of the Butler Society. And that book is, I might add, also available from butlersociety.org. There's a shop button there if you're interested. And we might share that detail if we can, David, with people. Okay, that's Kilkenny Castle on the front of the book, and that is Kilkenny Castle, a photograph taken recently. Many of you have probably been to Kilkenny Castle, which was the Ormond headquarters from 1391, rebuilt in the 19th century in its present castellated style. That's when the wing containing the long gallery, for those who know, that's when that was added. In 1967, Arthur Butler, the 6th Marquess of Ormond at this stage, and the 30th Chief Butler of Ireland, he gave the castle, Kilkenny Castle, to the people of Kilkenny. And later, he bought the land in front of the castle from the trustees in order that, and I quote, "it should never be built on, and the castle would be seen in all its dignity and splendor," which it is to this day. And he presented that land to the people of Kilkenny at the second Butler rally. It was an astonishing and a brilliant gift, although slightly overshadowed on the day by the arrival of someone claiming to be the lead singer of the Rolling Stones. And indeed it was no less a cad than Mick Jagger, who was wearing a huge green cloak. You can see him wearing that there, a white shirt, and those pants of his were orange. So he was dressed up as the Irish flag, or the Irish tricolour. He and his girlfriend, Marion Faithful, had been drinking Bacardi and Coke down in the nearby Kittler's Inn in Kilkenny when they heard of this event at Kilkenny Castle and rolled up. And I think it's disappointing for the Butlers in a sense, because the press were far more interested in Mick and Marianne than in the handing over of the keys of a castle that had been in the family for hundreds and hundreds of years. Okay, we then move on to the 7th Marquess of Ormond, Charles Butler, who's the 31st Chief Butler. He died in Chicago in 1997 with his death, the marquisate became extinct, but the earldom and the title chief butler is still sort of in existence and is now thought to be held by Viscount Mountgarrett, who's a direct descendant of the 8th Earl of Ormond, and I think he is living in America at the moment. I might be wrong. Okay, we are getting to the end of this this presentation, so do bear with me. Here is the front page of our website, as it is at the moment. As I mentioned, butler.org. The society was started in 1967, the same year that Kilkenny Castle was handed to the people of Kilkenny and that Mick Jagger showed up. And it was started by, well, as you now know, Hubert Butler, the essayist, his kinsman, Paddy Dunboyne, and George Butler, who was a retired chief superintendent of the Garda, the Irish police. And at the very first Butler Society rally in 1967, where I showed you the picture of my mum and dad at it, over 400 Butlers sat down to dine in the castle, which was at the time, it was sort of semi-derelict. And in the words of dear Mello, by flickering candlelight, they ate a banquet that had been brought by fast car from a hotel, carried up a ladder and through a window into the picture gallery. Since that first rally, there have been 19 more, the last being in London and Hever Castle and other parts of England in 2018. We have regional chapters of the Butler Society have been organizing gatherings and trips for years. The German von Butler families have had get-togethers in Berlin and Kassel. There's been gatherings in the UK, the USA, Canada, Spain, Lourdes and David, Argentina, New Zealand, all sorts of places. And indeed, as we were hearing just beforehand, the ties have been so close that one of the German butlers married a French butler at the very first rally, Jack and Suzanne, who are even listening even now. So who knows what a butler rally can do for you. Next up is the 20th rally, and never mind this sort of minor inconvenience that's going on planet Earth. The Canadian rally in Niagara-on-the-Lake, Ontario. The provisional dates are Thursday, the 4th of August to Sunday, the 7th of August, 2022. Be there or be square. Okay, you will find out about the rally and all these things on our website. Try and become a member. If you become a member, you will also get access to the brilliant archive that is 25 journals, which include over 300 articles about all the various branches and some of the characters I've mentioned, and many more besides. You will get regular newsletter updates and genealogical tidbits and notes and future rallies. But you'll also, it's quite a good way of keeping in touch with all the other butlers who become members. We are not a commercial research organization. Our website is not perfect yet. We are all volunteers, and we're not all that computer savvy yet. But there is much good stuff here, and the members, as I say, are very supportive of each other. So come along, become a member. It's not expensive, and maybe we shall meet you at a future rally. In the meantime, Butler ABOO. Okay.
Thank you very much, Turtle. That was a tour de force. Bravo, virtual clap. And thank you for bringing history to us and making history in the society frame in how it was done this evening.